The town of San Rico was drowning in a heat wave that had been going on for several weeks. Lawyer Martin Reynolds was sitting in his office on the second floor of an old brick building. The huge ceiling fan was spinning lazily, providing little relief. Martin was suffering from the heat as he skimmed through the documents related to yet another boring inheritance case. His life had long since become monotonous. The same days, the same client faces, and endless legal cases that brought neither challenge nor satisfaction. That evening, he decided to go to the Golden Lion Bar, a place where the townspeople gathered to discuss gossip, drink a cold beer, or simply escape the stuffy atmosphere of their own homes. The bar was located on the main street of San Rico and looked like it had stood still in the 80s. A worn wooden counter, dim light from lamps with crystal shades, and an old music box playing popular hits of the past decade. As Martin entered the bar, he felt the coolness of the air conditioning envelop his body. After ordering a glass of whiskey, he sat down in the corner by the window, where he could watch the street. The bar was half empty, and Martin watched a group of local laborers arguing about baseball and the bartender lazily rubbing glasses. And then she walked in. At first he didn't even notice, but he felt the atmosphere in the room change. The woman who appeared on the threshold was not just beautiful. She radiated confidence and magnetism that drew all eyes to her. Grace Lawrence was tall, slender, with long brown hair that fell in waves over her shoulders. Her dress, with a deep neckline and delicate lace, emphasized every line of her body, and her dark red lipstick made her look even more seductive. She walked up to the bar, seemingly oblivious to the many eyes following her. Her voice was low and velvety as she ordered a cocktail from the bartender. Martin noticed her look around for a moment and fix her gaze on him. Her eyes were deep, the color of dark amber, and there was a hint of mystery in them. A few minutes later, she approached him with a glass in her hand. "Are you Martin Reynolds?" she asked, smiling slightly. Martin looked up, trying to hide the unexpected excitement that her presence caused. "Yes, I am. And you are?" "Grace Lawrence," she replied, sitting down at the table across from him. "I hear you're the best lawyer in town. Can flattery help you win a case?" He smiled, feeling her confidence break his usually reserved demeanor. The conversation flowed easily, like water. Grace told him that she was married to Harold Lawrence, a wealthy and influential real estate developer 20 years her senior. Her voice was filled with a slight sadness as she recalled her marriage. "He is a man of great power, but such power often brings loneliness," she said quietly, looking down at her glass. Martin felt something in her words that touched him. He thought he was looking at a woman who was hiding deep pain behind a mask of confidence. Her laugh was light, but there was a tension in it that he could not help but notice. He would remember this evening for a long time. Grace Lawrence left behind not only a pleasant scent of perfume, but also a feeling that this acquaintance would change his life. For several days after their first meeting, Martin could not get Grace's image out of his mind. Her eyes and her voice, the way she moved, all of it left a deep mark on his mind. He found himself constantly recalling their conversation and replaying every phrase in his head. His usual life began to seem even more gray and monotonous against the background of her vivid image. And then she called again. Her voice on the phone was as charming as it had been when they met. "Martin," she said, "I need your help. Could you come to my place? I'm alone at home." The invitation was unexpected, but he could not refuse. The Lawrence mansion was located on a hill overlooking the entire city. It was a huge house with columns, large windows, and a swimming pool in the backyard. When Martin drove up to the gate, it opened automatically, as if Grace was already waiting for him. She met him on the terrace. She was less formal than she had been in the bar, a light sundress, bare feet, and her hair pulled back carelessly into a ponytail. But even so, she seemed charming. "Thank you for coming," she said, inviting him to sit by the pool. "Sometimes I just need someone to talk to." Her words sounded sincere, but Martin felt that there was something more behind them. They talked for hours. Grace talked about her marriage, how she felt isolated and lonely. She described Harold as a bossy man who controls every aspect of her life. "You can't imagine what it's like to live with a man who puts himself first," she said, looking into the pool water. "Sometimes I think my life would be so much better without him." Martin felt his heart clench with compassion. He could see the pain in her eyes, but also a hint of something darker, a desire to escape from this situation at any cost. Her words sounded like a call for help, but he couldn't help but feel that there was a hidden tension behind it that was growing with each passing day. This meeting left him confused. He couldn't figure out what it was about Grace that attracted him so much, her vulnerability or her determination. But he knew one thing: this woman had already begun to change his life. The idea that Grace had voiced during one of their conversations was so unexpected and daring that Martin did not even believe she was serious at first. They were sitting on the terrace of her mansion. The summer wind barely moved the leaves of the trees, and the scent of jasmine was in the air. Grace seemed to be thinking aloud. "I can't live like this anymore. Harold won't let me go. Even if I file for divorce, he will use all his connections to destroy me. The only way I can escape is if he is gone." Martin froze. His wine glass froze in midair as he realized what she was saying. "Are you serious?" he asked, looking her straight in the eye. She nodded. Her face was emotionless, but there was an iron determination in her voice. "Imagine, Martin," she continued, "if Harold had died in an accident. No one would have suspected us. His death would be my deliverance, and you and I could start a new life." Martin hesitated. On the one hand, the idea was horrible, immoral. On the other hand, he felt that Grace had already enchanted him so much that it was impossible to abandon her plan. "It's too dangerous," he finally said. "Any mistake and we'll be arrested." Grace put down her glass and looked at him with a calmness that was frightening. "We'll come up with a perfect plan. You're a lawyer. You know how the system works. We can do this." They spent the next few weeks carefully planning. Grace insisted that Harold's death should look like an accident. They settled on the idea of a fire because the old mansion had outdated wiring that could be used as an alibi. Martin researched all the legal aspects, from insurance claims to possible investigations. He helped Grace convince Harold to change his will and insurance policy to make her the sole beneficiary. She played the role of a loving wife worried about the future, and Harold didn't suspect a thing. Everything was going according to plan. "We have to be careful," Martin kept reminding us. "The slightest detail could give us away." Grace just smiled, as if she already saw herself free. But Martin couldn't shake the feeling that he was moving on thin ice, and that each step he took only brought him closer to the edge. It was a moonless night, with a heavy air that suggested a storm. The trees barely swayed in the faint wind, and the Lawrence house stood in the darkness like a silent monument. Martin sat in his car, parked a few blocks away from the mansion. His heart was beating so loudly that he could barely hear the night sounds. Every second seemed like an eternity. "It's just another case, another part of the job," he convinced himself, trying to calm his shaking hands. Armed with a small can of gasoline, a flashlight, and gloves, Martin entered the house through the back door. Grace had provided him with a key and ensured that the alarm system was turned off. Once inside, he stood for a few seconds, listening to the deep silence of the mansion. Only the sound of his own breathing echoed off the walls. Harold's bedroom was on the second floor. Martin made his way up there, sneaking, with his flashlight pointed downward so as not to attract attention. Harold was asleep, his steady breathing coming through the open door. Martin didn't dare look at him for long. He was focused on the task at hand. He acted quickly and carefully. He spilled gasoline in the room, creating lines that would ensure the fire would spread quickly. His movements were mechanical, like a machine, but his brain was working at a frantic pace. He was thinking about everything, possible traces, the time left before he could escape. At some point, Harold moved, and Martin froze, afraid to even breathe. But Harold did not wake up. Martin turned on the timer on a small device that was supposed to light the fire in 15 minutes and quickly left the room. As he left the house, he threw the canister into the bushes and headed for his car. As he started the engine and drove away, his hands were still shaking. Somewhere far away in the rearview mirror, he saw the first faint flames. The fire consumed the house quickly. Martin returned to his apartment, trying to force himself to calm down. He knew that the police would treat it as an accident. Everything had been planned perfectly. But there was a fear in his heart that he couldn't shake. The fear that he still underestimated Grace. It had been only a few weeks since the fire that claimed Harold Lawrence's life. Grace played the role of the grieving widow brilliantly, dressed in a black dress, with eyes red with tears. Her grace and sadness in public evoked sympathy from even the most cynical San Ricans. However, Martin began to notice disturbing changes in her behavior. She no longer called him as often as she used to. Her voice, once warm and enthusiastic, became cold and distant. At first, he put it down to stress and grief after the loss of her husband. But when she ignored his call one day and only replied with a dry message a day later, his doubts began to grow into real anxiety. One evening, on his way home from work, Martin decided to stop by a restaurant on the main street to have dinner. In the parking lot, he noticed a car that looked familiar. It was Grace's car. He entered the restaurant and saw her at a table in the far corner. She was not sitting alone. The man who accompanied her was young, athletic, and confident. Their conversation was animated, and Grace's laugh was sincere and free, not at all like the one she had shown during their meetings. Martin was frozen in place. His thoughts whirled chaotically, and his heart pounded. He decided not to approach, but that evening remained in his memory as the moment when everything began to fall apart. He realized that something had changed between them, but he couldn't yet accept the truth that was gradually being revealed to him. The next day, he received an anonymous letter in an envelope with no stamps or signatures. Opening it, Martin saw a short message. "You were only an instrument. Her game is not yet complete." The words were written in block letters, making it impossible to identify the handwriting. But their meaning was clear to him. Martin decided to act. His anxiety gave way to a determination to find out the truth. He began to follow Grace. After a few days, he noticed that she often met with the same man. His name was Alex. He was a young photographer, ambitious and clearly fascinated by Grace. Their meetings were not random. They spent time together in coffee shops, restaurants, and even at her home. Martin became increasingly convinced that he was part of a carefully planned conspiracy. Grace and Alex were using him as a means to eliminate Harold. She played the role of the victim, making him think they had something special. And now that her plan had been successfully implemented, Martin was rendered redundant. His fear turned to rage. He began to gather evidence. He still had copies of the forged documents he had created at Grace's request. He also had recordings of their phone conversations discussing the details of the plot. Martin realized that this evidence could be his only salvation. One evening, he took a chance and met Grace at the bar where they first met. She arrived late, calm and confident, as if nothing had happened. Martin looked at her with a bitter smile. "Do you think I didn't notice?" he asked, holding up the photos of her and Alex's meetings. "Do you think you can get rid of me that easily?" Grace shrugged her shoulders, her face unmoved, but her eyes were tinged with anxiety. She realized that Martin was no longer the naive man he had been. "You have no proof," she said calmly, but her voice trembled slightly. "Are you sure?" he replied, throwing an envelope with copies of documents in front of her. "Everything we did together could now turn against you." Grace tried to remain calm, but her hands betrayed her nervousness. She took the envelope, looked through the documents, and realized that her trap was beginning to close around her. This meeting was a turning point. Martin handed over his evidence to the police, realizing it was the only way to protect himself. He knew Grace and Alex might try to retaliate, but now he had the means to fight back. Grace no longer had power over him, and this feeling finally brought him some relief, even if there was still a long struggle ahead. The trial against Grace Lawrence and her lover Alex began in a San Rico courtroom packed with journalists, curious citizens, and members of the public. For many, it was a sensation, a high-profile case of murder, treason, and conspiracy that revealed the dark side of a life of privilege. Martin Reynolds sat in the courtroom, feeling a strange combination of anxiety and relief. He realized that his testimony would be decisive. Although he himself was involved in the crime, his cooperation with the police and his confession helped to gather enough evidence against Grace and Alex. Grace looked calm as she sat in the dock. Her face remained impenetrable, like a mask. She was dressed in a sharp suit that emphasized her confidence, but her eyes betrayed tension. Alex, who sat next to her, looked less steady, his eyes constantly darting around the room and his hands nervously fumbling through the documents. When Martin was called to the podium, the room stood still. He could feel every eye on him. His voice sounded firm as he began to give details. He described how Grace had gradually drawn him into the conspiracy, her manipulations and promises. He provided the court with copies of forged documents, recordings of their conversations, and photographs that proved her relationship with Alex. "She knew how to exploit my weaknesses," Martin said, looking directly at the judge. "She made me believe that she and I could build a future together. But it was all a lie." Martin's words sounded sincere, and the judge listened carefully to his every word. Grace's lawyers tried to cast doubt on his testimony, but the evidence presented was too strong to ignore. The trial culminated with the playing of a recording in which Grace and Alex discussed how they would get rid of Martin after Harold's death. In the recording, her voice sounded cold and determined. "He's done his job. We don't need him anymore." This recording was the final blow that destroyed all of Grace's chances of exoneration. The room was abuzz, and for the first time in the entire trial, Grace lost her cool. Her face turned white, and her lips trembled slightly. The judge delivered his verdict a few days later. Grace Lawrence was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Alex, who played the role of her accomplice, received 10 years in prison for complicity. When the verdict was announced, Grace turned her head sharply toward Martin, and her gaze was full of hatred. After the trial, Martin left the courtroom feeling that everything he had experienced was almost unreal. His reputation as a lawyer was ruined, and he realized that there was no place for him in San Rico anymore. He packed up his things and left the city, determined to start a new life somewhere far away, where no one knew his past. But even in the new place, peace did not come to him immediately. At night, he often dreamed of Grace's eyes, cold, manipulative, but also magical. He knew that this story would forever stay with him, as a reminder of his mistakes and the price he had to pay for temptation.